Welcome back to Through the Valley. This is your host, Bahar Alexander, executive coach, author, and speaker. Today, I want to explore a question that has quietly occupied my mind for years. A question that has become clear after more than 2 decades of coaching senior leaders across industries, cultures, and continents. The question is this: what is the great differentiator? Not what differentiates an average leader from a good leader, but what differentiates an exceptional leader from one entrusted with carrying the greatest responsibility. What John C. Maxwell aptly refers to as the fifth level leader, the pinnacle. Because there comes a point in every leadership career where the rules quietly change. There isn't an announcement. No one pulls you aside and says, "Congratulations, you've entered a different game now." But it happens somewhere between leading a team, leading a function, leading a business, and preparing for the highest level of leadership. The criteria begins to shift. Early in our careers, leadership development is relatively straightforward. We acquire knowledge, we develop skills, we improve communication, we learn strategy, we strengthen financial acumen, we become better at influencing. We learn how to delegate. We become more effective decision makers. And these things matter. In fact, they are essential because capability creates opportunity. Capability earns promotions. Capability builds credibility. Capability opens doors. But eventually, every leader in the room is capable. Every executive sitting around the boardroom table has delivered results. Every finalist for the CEO position has an improved resume. Every candidate has led transformation. Every candidate understands strategy. Every candidate has technical excellence. At this altitude, capability is no longer the differentiator. It is the expectation. And yet, only one person will ultimately be entrusted with carrying what comes next. Why is that? I've spent years asking myself that question. And I don't believe the answer is another leadership competency. I don't believe it's another communication technique. I don't believe it's another executive presence course or another strategic framework. I believe something much deeper begins determining who continues to rise. Which brings me to something I've observed over the years. I believe there are actually two leadership journeys. The first is one every organization invests in. I call it the capability journey. This journey is visible. It can be measured. It appears on performance reviews, on competency models, on promotional criteria. It asks the question, can this person communicate? Can they execute? Can they influence? Can they solve complex problems? Can they lead a team? Can they deliver results? The capability journey teaches us how to do leadership. And it's incredibly important. But somewhere along the way, a second journey quietly begins. One that very few organizations know how to develop. One that doesn't appear on performance reviews. One that doesn't fit neatly into a competency framework. One that is far more difficult to measure. I call this journey the journey of becoming. This journey asks very different questions. Not what can you do, but who are you becoming while you're doing it? Because leadership eventually stops being about what you know. It becomes about who is carrying what you know. And those are not the same things. One develops competence, the other develops capacity. Capacity to remain calm in uncertainty. Capacity to hold opposite perspectives without collapsing into certainty. Capacity to regulate emotions under immense pressure. Capacity to absorb complexity without becoming overwhelmed. Capacity to make difficult decisions while remaining deeply human. Capacity to influence without needing to control. Capacity to remain grounded when everyone around you is looking for certainty. These are not leadership skills. These are expressions of leadership maturity. Most organizations continue investing in capability long after the leader's greatest opportunity for growth has shifted toward becoming. It's almost as if we keep sharpening the tool while ignoring the hand holding it. Recently, I had a conversation that reminded me of this distinction. I asked a senior executive a simple question. How have you grown as a leader over the past 5 years? He paused. Then he began telling me about the business. Revenue had grown. The culture had improved. Performance had increased. The organization had transformed. His team had expanded. Everything he shared was impressive. But he didn't answer the question because I didn't ask him, what has your organization achieved? I asked, who have you become? That moment stayed with me. Not because his answer was wrong, but because it reflected something I see repeatedly among accomplished leaders. Many can describe the evolution of the business. Far fewer can describe the evolution of themselves. And for much of a leadership career, that transition doesn't matter. Capability wins, execution wins, results win, but eventually something changes. The higher leaders rise, the smaller the field becomes. There are fewer opportunities, fewer seats, and often only one role left to aspire to: CEO, president, managing director, global head. At that level, everyone has capability. Everyone has experience. Everyone has results. Technical excellence is no longer impressive. It's assumed. And the question quietly changes from, can this person lead the business, to something much more subtle. Can this person embody the leadership required for what comes next? That, I believe, is the great differentiator. Not another competency, not another certification, not another achievement. The human being behind the capability. Because organizations don't simply entrust their future to the most technically capable leader. They entrust it to the leader whose presence creates confidence, whose judgment creates trust, whose steadiness creates psychological safety, whose character can carry complexity, whose identity is no longer dependent on proving himself. That is a very different kind of leadership. And I believe this is the transition almost nobody prepares a leader for. The transition from performing leadership to embodying leadership. And that's where I want to take you in the next part of this conversation. Because if embodiment is the great differentiator, the next question becomes, what prevents exceptional leaders from making that transition? In the first part of this conversation, I introduced what I believe is the great differentiator. There comes a point in every leadership career where capability is no longer enough. The journey shifts from learning how to lead to becoming the kind of human being who can carry greater leadership, which naturally brings us to the next question. If this transition is so important, why do so many exceptional leaders plateau? After more than 20 years of coaching leaders, I've come to believe that the answer isn't lack of intelligence. It isn't lack of ambition. It isn't lack of work ethics. And it certainly isn't a lack of capability. The obstacle is something much quieter, much less visible, much more difficult to recognize. I call it internal friction. Think about friction for a moment. When two surfaces rub against one another, energy is lost. Movement becomes harder. Progress requires more effort. Not because energy lacks power, but because resistance is consuming it. I believe the same thing happens psychologically. Many leaders don't lack capability. They don't. They lack available energy because so much of it is being consumed by invisible internal friction. Not consciously, subconsciously. And that's what makes it so difficult to recognize. From the outside, they look successful. They perform, they influence, they deliver. They build businesses, they lead transformation. But underneath, there is quiet exhaustion, not burnout. Something more subtle, a constant internal effort to hold everything together, an effort that never quite ends. Over the years, I've noticed this friction tends to organize itself around three themes. I call them the three invisible frictions of leadership. First one is the friction of failure. Some leaders never truly leave the proving game. Achievement becomes relief, but only temporarily. The promotion comes, the pressure lifts for a moment. Then another mountain appears, another expectation, another benchmark, another comparison. Nothing ever feels enough. Not because they lack achievement, but because their identity is still negotiating its own worth. They continue performing, but rarely experience peace. The second friction is the friction of success. This one surprises many people. Success itself becomes heavy. Questions begin appearing quietly. Can I sustain this? What if I disappoint people? What if everyone discovers I'm not as capable as they think I am? What if I'm a fraud? The very thing they spend years building becomes something they now feel responsible for protecting. Success no longer creates freedom. It creates vigilance. The third friction is the friction of significance. This may be least understood and perhaps the most powerful one of the three. Growth changes identity. The higher we rise, the more visible we become. Relationships change, expectations increase, influence expands. And beneath all of that, an unconscious question often begins to emerge. If I fully become who I am capable of becoming, what might I lose? Belonging, acceptance, connection, identity? familiarity, the old version of ourselves. Many leaders believe they fear failure. I don't think that's entirely true. I think many leaders fear transformation because transformation asks us to become unfamiliar to ourselves. And unfamiliar feels unsafe to a nervous system designed to preserve familiarity. This is where I believe most leadership development stops. Organizations see the behavior. They teach another skill, improve communication, increase executive presence, strengthen influence, develop strategy. But behavior is rarely the root cause. Behavior is the expression. The architecture underneath it is the cause. This is why my work begins somewhere entirely different. Not with behavior, not even with performance, but with what I call integration. Because before a leader can embody greater leadership, they must integrate the experiences that continue shaping them unconsciously. The disappointments, the success, the losses, the identity shifts, the emotional wounds, their survivor strategies. Without integration, these experiences don't disappear. They become architecture. They quietly influence the leader's perception, their decision making, their relationships, their communication, their confidence, and their presence. This naturally leads to the second phase, internal architecture. Here we begin asking entirely different questions. We ask, why do I react to this way? Why does uncertainty activate me? Why do I over-control? Why do I hesitate? Why do I need to be in the details? Why is it hard for me to give away responsibility? Why is it hard for me to trust? Why do I need certainty before acting? Why do I over-explain? Why do I avoid difficult conversations? Why do I seek validation from people I've already outgrown? These aren't personality traits, which most people mistake them for. These are architectural patterns. Patterns developed long before we ever stepped into leadership. And until we understand that architecture, we continue mistaking survival for strategy. Once leaders begin integrating those patterns, something remarkable starts happening. They begin developing what I call inner authority. Inner authority is not confidence. Confidence often depends on some sort of outcome. Inner authority doesn't. Confidence says, I believe I can. Inner authority says, I know who I am regardless. Confidence fluctuates. Inner authority stabilizes. Confidence seeks certainty. Inner authority tolerates ambiguity. Confidence wants reassurance. Inner authority creates reassurance for others. And this is where something extraordinary begins to emerge. True embodied executive presence. Not because we practiced it, not because we performed it, but because the interferences were removed. This is perhaps the biggest misunderstanding in leadership development today. Executive presence is not something we add. It is something that naturally emerges when internal friction is reduced, when fear no longer consumes attention, when identity no longer depends on proving itself, when survival no longer governs perception. Presence appears naturally. Clarity appears authentically. Wisdom appears spontaneously. Discernment appears. Influence changes. People experience you differently, not because your techniques changed, because you changed. And that brings me to another idea I've been reflecting on. Everyone talks about growth. Very few people talk about leadership gravity. Gravity is what keeps a rocket connected to Earth. The closer it remains, the stronger the pull. Leadership has gravity too. Not physical gravity, psychological gravity. Conditioning, identity, fear, old narratives, survivor strategies. These forces continuously pull leaders back towards familiar ways of thinking, reacting, and relating. Which explains why transformation often feels so incredibly difficult. Not because you're moving in the wrong direction, but because every meaningful expansion requires moving beyond the gravitational pull of the old self. The question isn't, why is this so hard? The better question is, what is pulling me back? Because once we understand the gravity, we stop judging the resistance. We begin working with it. And that is where real transition begins. Not from capability to another competency, but from performance to embodiment. And that transition is where the greatest differentiator is born. As we come to the end of today's conversation, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. When I began coaching leaders over 20 years ago, I believed my role was to help them become better leaders. Today, I see my role very differently. I don't believe leadership transformation begins by teaching people how to lead. I believe it begins by helping leaders remove everything that prevents their leadership from naturally emerging. That is a very different philosophy. Because if you've listened to the previous episodes of Through the Valley, you'll recognize the progression we've been exploring together. We begin with integration because experiences that remain unprocessed don't disappear. They become patterns. Then we explored internal architecture because patterns eventually become the subconscious structures through which we perceive ourselves, other people, uncertainty, complexity, success, failure, and leadership itself. Then we arrive at inner authority, the place where leaders begin making decisions from discernment rather than fear, where external validation no longer determines internal stability, where identity becomes anchored internally instead of externally, based on the applause for the good outcomes. But there is one more phase, one that naturally emerges when the first three have been cultivated. And I believe this is the great differentiator: embodiment. Embodiment isn't something you perform. It isn't another competency. It is not charisma. It is not confidence. It isn't even executive presence, although it is a gateway to it. Embodiment is what happens when who you are becomes congruent with how you lead. No separation. Complete internal alignment. When there is no longer a gap between your values and your decisions, between your communication and your character, between your words and your nervous system. People experience this before you can explain it. It shifts the energy of a room. You've probably met leaders like this. They don't need to dominate the room. They don't need to convince people they're capable. They don't need to constantly prove themselves. Their presence speaks before they do. Not because they're trying to project authority, but because they no longer spend enormous amounts of energy protecting their identity. That energy becomes available for listening, for creativity, available for discernment, for courage, available for people. This is leadership magnetism, not manufactured, not rehearsed, not strategically performed, embodied. And perhaps this is why some leaders continue becoming more influential as they become quieter, more grounded, more curious, more present. Because wisdom has replaced performance. Presence has replaced proving. Discernment has replaced certainty. When I think about the leaders I've had the privilege of coaching over the years, the ones who experienced the greatest transformation didn't simply become better communicators, or better strategists, or better executives. They became different human beings. They stopped seeking permission. They became less reactive. They tolerated uncertainty without collapse into urgency. They stopped confusing activity with progress. They became more intentional with their words, more discerning with their decisions, more comfortable saying no, more willing to have difficult conversations, more capable of carrying complexity without becoming consumed by it, and far more capable of multiplying themselves, creating a legacy through duplicating extraordinary leaders. Not because life became easier, but because their internal architecture became stronger. And that, I believe, is the future of leadership. Not simply developing more capable leaders, but developing more integrated human beings. Because organizations don't rise beyond the internal capacity of the people leading them. Cultures don't become psychologically safe because someone attended a workshop. They become psychologically safe because leaders embody psychological safety. Not perform it, embody it. Innovation doesn't emerge because leaders ask for creativity. It emerges because leaders have reduced enough internal friction to create environments where creativity can exist. Trust isn't built through techniques. It's built through congruence. The future of leadership isn't another competency model. It's human development. It's leadership evolution. It's helping leaders become the kind of people capable of carrying the future they're trying to create. So before we close, I would like to leave you with one reflection. Not about your business, not about your performance, not about your results. About you. Take out your journal or simply sit quietly for a few moments and ask yourself this question. Who have I become over the past 5 years, independent of what I have accomplished? Can I describe my internal evolution as clearly as I can describe my external achievements? What internal friction continues consuming energy that could otherwise become presence? Where am I still performing leadership instead of embodying it? And perhaps the most important question of all, if someone removed my title tomorrow, what leadership would remain? Sit with that question. Don't rush to the answer. Because your first answer will probably come from your mind. The deeper answer will come from your awareness. That awareness is where integration begins. And integration is where leadership evolution begins. Thank you for joining me on Through the Valley. If today's conversation changed the way you think about leadership, I have one request. Think of one senior leader in your life. Someone who is capable, ambitious, and standing on the edge of their next level expansion. Someone who has mastered performance, but is now being invited into embodiment. Share this episode with them. Because sometimes one conversation, one question, or one new perspective is all it takes to begin a completely different leadership journey. And if Through the Valley is adding value to your own journey, I would be grateful if you followed the podcast and left a review. It helps these conversations reach more leaders who are ready to move beyond performance and begin the deeper work of becoming. And remember this, leadership isn't ultimately measured by what you build. It is revealed by who you've become while building it. And perhaps that is the greatest differentiator of all. And for now, I would like to leave you with this. Shift your psychology to shift your energy and change your leadership. Until next time.